Our first client was Apple, and this was iPhone 1. So we quit our jobs, myself and my business partner, started a firm. We had one client. It was Apple. The iPhone turned out to be a big deal. But, at the time, Nokia and Motorola were much bigger companies. And we were working on issues like disability issues around access to the iPhone, which, hadn't quite been figured out yet. And I like to say that you take the risk. On the other hand, the first client could have turned out to be a dud. And it turned out that our first client was Apple. So there's a little luck involved too.
What do you need to know if you're ready to launch a government affairs strategy? How do you find the right lobbyist? And how has the practice of lobbying changed over the past decade? Today, I am joined on the Abstract with my friend, Matt Tanielian. Matt is the co-founder of Franklin Square Group, a boutique bipartisan government relations agency focused on bridging the gap between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. So perfect for a lot of our listeners who tend to be lawyers in the tech space in-house. Before starting FSG, he was a director in Cisco's Washington office, and he also spent time on the Hill as counsel to a U.S. senator from New Jersey. He worked there on key issues shaping the future of the internet, like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the Inbox Privacy Act, also known as the Spam Act, the Microsoft antitrust investigation, something that a lot of folks continue to talk about in DC, as well as several major telecom mergers. Matt, thanks so much for joining me today for this episode of The Abstract.
Thanks for having me. This is a great opportunity. Really appreciate it.
You've got a lot of practical advice to share with our listeners today. But before we get started, I was reading your bio. I did not know this about you. Before you came to DC, you actually spent time as a car salesman. Tell us about that and what you learned from that experience, maybe things that you still apply today in your lobbying and government affairs work.
Yes, that's a true story. Selling cars in the 90s in Boston. You can only imagine some of the characters that I worked with. But it was a really good experience. It was really invaluable to me in my career, oddly enough, looking back, because ability to interact with people, learning how to interact with people, learning how to get people to trust you and want to listen to you, and selling. Whatever you're selling cars, selling, whatever services, whatever it is, that's a skill. And it's something that I picked up there. Looking back on it, it was only 3 months. It was a summer job. I did not tell that to the sales manager who hired me. and when I went into a day in August and said, "Hey, I'm leaving," he said, "I thought you said that you needed money so that you could go back, afford to continue your school." And I said, no, I made that up. And he goes, "Oh, man, maybe you'll fit in here after all."
Yeah, I feel like if there's any profession
where it's okay to tell that story. Yeah.
Yeah. What was your biggest sale?
I sold a lease on a Honda Prelude. That was the hottest, souped up sport version of it, and it was a particularly hard to get color, and somebody just wanted it so bad, and they came in. That was so easy. There were other sales that were really hard, but we find somebody who just really wants one thing, and you've got it. It's easy to do.
So you end up in DC and you go to law school. At the time, did you know that you wanted to work in government, you wanted to work in policy, or did you just sort of end up in Washington by happenstance?
I did not. It was really the opposite. My father was a trial lawyer. My mom thought I'd be a law professor. I ended up in DC just because that's where I had some friends after college and applied here and got in. Once you're here, there is an attraction to politics. I did practice for a couple years, but wasn't enjoying it all that much. And a friend of mine was a campaign manager for a senator who, when he won, was put on the Senate Judiciary Committee and called me and said, "Hey, Bob is on the Senate Judiciary Committee, or is going to be. He's going to need a couple of lawyers. Would you be interested?" And after 2 years of being a real lawyer, I thought, wow, that sounds like a really, really interesting opportunity. The Senate Judiciary Committee is a place, look around. Pat Leahy at the time, Senator Biden, Ed Kennedy. It was a pretty heady place to go spend your early years as a lawyer. And it was quite an honor to work there. So
this is a little bit of a sort of like government 101, government relations 102 podcast. And we're also going to talk about how government affairs and lobbying has changed over time. Just as a background question for folks, what's the difference between working for a committee versus working directly for a member of Congress?
Right. It's a good question. If you look at the Senate Judiciary Committee, the chairman of the committee today, Dick Durbin from Illinois, probably has about 25 or 30 lawyers and then some more staffers working for him. They've got a lawyer that does just immigration. They've got several lawyers that do judges. They've got people who are expert at criminal law or antitrust. And so it's a huge staff. And and many of them have been around for a very long time. They are political, but not so much. And they are really, truly experts. Whereas working for a member of the committee, my boss, who was a freshman member of the committee, there were 2 lawyers. We had to cover every issue at the Senate Judiciary Committee and then a bunch of other stuff that we were handed by our bosses. And it was a lot. You couldn't be expert on any one thing. I think, as you noted, I happened to be there at sort of the beginnings of the internet, legal structure, right? So the end of the 1990s, we did the, CDA 230, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, electronic signatures bills, all these sort of core components of the internet. I liked working on that stuff. I also did about 12 other issues. I worked with antitrust and telecom and antitrust and Microsoft. I worked on immigration issues, a whole host of other things that happened in the Judiciary Committee that just had nothing to do with tech issues whatsoever. It was the tech issues that I kind of got interested in. And I had no idea that that's what I'd find interesting when I got to the Hill. I was a campaign finance lawyer. I no longer found that interesting. So I tried to find something else. And that's how I sort of gravitated towards tech, being there on sort of the ground floor of some of that early legal structure stuff that was passed.
And do you feel like this is sort of a 2-part question, I suppose, both for folks who might want to get into policy work, but also for those folks who might be looking for people to help them navigate the landscape that's DC. Do you feel like you need a law degree? Like, what's the right sort of path in DC that involves a law degree versus just a background in policy or public affairs? And similarly, for companies that are looking for help, when do they need a lawyer involved versus when does someone who just has many years of experience, say, on the Hill or in the White House or in the agencies, right?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, especially from folks who are trying to get into Washington or trying to decide whether government affairs is something they'd be interested in doing. It's been great having a law degree. It's important, but it's not required. There's a lot of people who do my job who don't. Now, I work on the Senate Judiciary Committee, as you can guess by its name. There's a lot of lawyers there, but there are other committees, where the expertise isn't as much around legal issues, and you don't have as many lawyers, although you certainly have some. So I would say it's great, not required. For my business, Franklin Square Group is a boutique technology lobbying firm. We pride ourselves on not just being door openers, and there are a lot of good lobbying firms in Washington. That's what they do. They do the politics piece, they do the door opening piece, but then you're kind of on your own. As specialists, we can't really do just that. We have to be strong enough on the policy, on the technology to be able to walk the walk and talk the talk if we're going to be specialists. Being a lawyer has helped me with that, sort of melding that together, melding the politics and the policy together into a strategic thought, sometimes really on the fly, sometimes with a plan. But being able to think on your feet, analyze a situation, and give context to something for your clients. To me, that's the piece that the law, the experience, I don't know if the law degree But the experience of being in law school helped me a lot in being able to meld policy and politics together.
Yeah, I mean, there is a parallel there too, in that a lot of the really good lawyers that I've worked with have the ability to spin up and become an expert on something very quickly. And that's not only helpful for understanding the law or understanding, a new reg or policy proposal, or you really understand the business too, and what are the drivers of the business, and where is revenue going to come from, and how is the product going to evolve, and then where does that meet the market? I feel like there's a similar sort of learning curve in spinning up on a law as there is in spinning up on how a business is planning to grow.
I think that's absolutely right. And having a law degree and having that background helped me sort of think critically about things. And analyze them and pull that all together in a way that I think is valuable.
What was launching your own firm like? And take us sort of also back to the time that you launched it. What was the environment around tech policy? Was it scary to go out and hang a proverbial shingle, or did you feel like this was a well-worn path? Take us back there.
Yeah, I mentioned my dad was a trial lawyer. I always had this sort of entrepreneurial bent. I wasn't really sure when it would come out, but this is when it did. It was scary. I'd spent 5 years at Cisco. It was a great job. I had a lot of stock options. It was a good place that I could have spent many more years. But I had that sort of itch and thought, there's a real opportunity here. Because at Cisco and before that, a trade association I worked for, I'd hired consultants. This is in the mid 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you'd hire, and they were door openers.
Yeah.
Computer chips, potato chips, they didn't care. They didn't understand the culture of the industry. And I hired them and they got me in the doors I needed to get into. But my thought was, well, there's probably a better way to do this. There's probably an opportunity for a firm that specializes in tech, that understands the culture of Silicon Valley, that understands the innovative drive of these companies, and that they're different than, ExxonMobil or Walmart. And that difference is of value and something that you could present as an attribute. And so that was sort of the light bulb that went off. I think we could do this. And, I knew it was a risk, but I knew it was sort of the risk that I wanted as an entrepreneur. And the time we were doing it was, an interesting time. This was 2008. In a financial crisis. Not an awesome time to, hey, let's start a new business. But what we had was a client. Our first client was Apple.
Oh, wow.
And this was iPhone 1. And so we quit our jobs, myself and my business partner, quit our jobs, started a firm. We had one client. It was Apple. The iPhone turned out to be a big deal. So that all worked out. But, at the time, Nokia and Motorola were much bigger companies. And nobody was sure that the iPhone would be a hit. And we were working on issues like disability issues around access to the iPhone, which, hadn't quite been figured out yet. But it was a different time. And I like to say that you take the risk, and I'd like to take the credit for taking the risk. On the other hand, the first client could have turned out to be a dud. And it turned out that our first client was Apple. So there's a little luck involved too. Right place at the right time. You got on the right elevator, and the rest is history.
How do you feel like, having seen that whole sort of evolution, Apple, Google, others really growing up in DC and building out huge practices, and how do you feel like the tenor of the conversation has changed over, say, the past 15 years around tech?
Yeah, and that's the timeline for the firm, right? 15 years now. And if you go back, it was iPhone 1, Facebook had, 50, 80, 100 million subscribers. I think maybe one or two tech companies were in the top 10 market cap companies in the world. It was just a very different time. Tech was still new. And in Washington, there's definitely a shine. on the tech industry.
Yeah.
And people wanted to talk to us. And that's a real advantage when you're in Washington, because I've worked with other people subsequent to that, it's a little harder to get. Now, that all came with a cost. That success, the top 5 companies in the world are now all tech companies. And they've all grown up. And Facebook doesn't have 100 million subscribers. It has 3 billion subscribers.
Yeah.
Big has definitely become what the industry is, and that has consequences, and it had consequences in Washington. A lot of people took to the opportunity to criticize the industry for this or that or the other thing, and so there's been a lot more defense than offense in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. For our part, Franklin Square Group's clientele has kind of evolved too. We started off with Apple. Google, in the early days of Google in Washington, was one of our very first clients. Intel, Cisco, big companies. Yeah. But as time went on, it got much more diverse. We started representing smaller and smaller companies. Today, we don't represent Apple or Google after having represented them for about 12 or 13 years. We represent a lot of startups. And that's a different dynamic, some different lobbying muscles that you use. But I think it's been an interesting evolution, and those were startups, or at least smaller companies when we started with them. And now we're back to representing some of the smaller companies, which is, I think, really fascinating.
Let's say that I am one of those startups. I'm VC backed. I'm looking to hire my first GR consultant or consulting firm in DC. How do you recommend folks approach that process? And is there sort of legwork that needs to be put in ahead of time, or work that needs to be done internally for that relationship to be successful? Or is your advice generally go and find the firm and they'll guide you through it?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't give that advice. The main piece of advice I would give is you take a step back. Think about why you're doing this. Decide what your goal is in Washington. It's the mistake I see more often than anything else, which is folks just rush into it and they talk to some, as you said, lobbying firm that's like, hey, great, we'll set up a bunch of meetings. And they run up on the Hill and they talk to a bunch of people, and they're not really sure what they're trying to do, but it's more like a good exercise. And they come back and they're like, I don't understand what the point of that was. Yep. It kind of sours the whole thing. And so when folks come to me, I kind of encourage them to take that step back. Let's define your goals, and then we can build out the strategy and the tactics. If you go directly to tactics and just start doing meetings, as any lobbying firm in Washington can help set up meetings for you. But if you're going to sort of sit down and come up with a strategy that fits your company, fits what you're trying to do, and is there to achieve an actual goal, as opposed to just, let's come to Washington because it might be interesting and fun. Right. And hey, there are companies that want to do that too, and that's great. But that would be my advice: take a step back, think about why you're doing this, and then go on and work it out from there. And a good firm can help you do that if you decide, figure out what it is that I'm actually trying to do here. Think around strategies, and set up more meetings is not a strategy.
Right.
But a good firm can help you do that. And I'd say sure. on the question of the legwork, talk to people. Like, Washington is a very unique place, and what we do is not the same as any other part of the law. That you talk to people like you. And I'm always happy to talk to people. I have a big network of folks that I talk to, not just clients or people that I want to be clients, but just because as somebody who's represented the industry for the last 15 years, I think that's helpful. There are other folks, whether they're your VC or maybe some other corporate mentors that you have, talk to them, see how they did it. Because I don't think there's any one way to do it, but I do think it ought to be deliberate, not reactive.
I'm sure you also are sort of the first hire, we'll call it quote unquote, for a lot of these startups in DC. In other words, maybe, you're working with the GC, or you're working even sometimes directly with the CEO, and they haven't hired a full-time lobbyist or government affairs person internally. How do you counsel clients on leveraging firms, outside resources, consultants, as opposed to making their first full-time hire or making additional full-time hires themselves?
That's a good question. And there's no perfect way to do this. Each company is going to have its own set of problems and challenges. I've represented over 100 companies. The majority of them, we were their first people in Washington. And sometimes they hired their first government affairs person and then they hired us. Sometimes we were hired by the GC or even the CEO. And we help guide them through, okay, here's how you set up an office. We've done this with a lot of startups that are doing that. There's no perfect way to do it. Sometimes it depends on the issues that the company's facing. And how fast that is developing. But I do think we could either help supplement and build a team, or we can help help a GC or a CEO who's thinking, what do I do in Washington? How do I set one of these up? And we've seen them all. Some set up not that great. some that really do work well.
The Abstract is brought to you by SpotDraft, an end-to-end contract lifecycle management system that helps high-performing legal teams become 10 times more efficient. If you spend hours every week drafting and reviewing contracts, worrying about being blindsided by renewals, or if you just want to streamline your contracting processes, SpotDraft is the right solution for you. From creating and managing templates and workflows, to tracking approvals, e-signing, and reporting via an AI-powered repository, SpotDraft helps you in every stage of your contracting. And because it should work where you work, it integrates with all the tools your business already uses. SpotDraft is the key that unlocks the potential of your legal team. Make your contracting easier today at spotdraft.com.
One of the things that I've had success with in the past, and this is maybe in the absence of financial resources to hire a full-time person or consultant, is leveraging, say, coalitions or industry associations, places like you worked earlier in your career. And I know you've also stood up a number of coalitions, including recently. How do you counsel clients on getting the most out of coalitions or industry orgs? Because I'm sure a number of your clients retain Franklin Square Group alongside being members of a whole host of different other industry orgs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of what goes on in Washington, the trade associations, the coalitions. We've seen coalitions grow even more so in Washington around the tech industry because there's such a diverse set of issues. It's not like this isn't the Motion Picture Industry Association representing movie studios, and there's 8 movie studios or 6, and there's one association and they all work in the same place. Tech is just so much more diverse and so much bigger that you have multiple associations, and then literally there's probably a dozen different spin-off coalitions on a particular issue, or many issues. It's hard to get the value out of those groups. And that's one of the things, having worked at a trade association, most of my team has either worked at companies or trade associations or both. It's really important to get your value out of those. In order to do that, you have to understand how they're working and why they're doing what they're doing. The flip side of it is, as great as belonging to an association can be, or a coalition sort of helping you be part of a particular advocacy issue, or sort of getting your toes wet in Washington, they don't represent you. They represent the group, and you shouldn't take that as representing you. So if you need to build your brand, or you have a particular issue or a particular take on an issue, or want to sell to the government what your product is, you're going to need to do it on your own. And you can't really rely on the coalition to do that. Like I said, good place to dip your toes in. And if you're going to do it, you should manage it and get the most out of it, because you can get more or less out of belonging to a group like that. But at the end of the day, the representation is of the group, not you individually. And there's always usually somebody bigger in the group than you.
Yes.
Who gets the most attention.
I've experienced that before. And it's not in a malicious way or anything. It's just one large company, maybe a more important financial backer for the industry org, or the industry org may realize that if they lost that member, that then their views and access would dwindle on the Hill and elsewhere. You need to be mindful of sort of who else is in the room and whose opinions matter a lot. The one advantage, though, I would say of working with industry orgs is it doesn't always mean that you need to stick your neck out, right? And I'm sure that you've experienced that as well. First of all, it's better to have a whole host of friends who are all saying the same thing, but sometimes you don't even need to take a public position at all because your group is going to take one for you.
Yeah, safety in numbers is a strategy sometimes, and it's a good one. It also can be working with others can be a valuable thing. The teamwork of it, the understanding, especially for smaller companies. Once you get in the room, and then you realize how many other people are in the room. You go, oh, wow, I have a lot more fellow travelers than I might have been able to figure out on my own. I had one company that looks pretty much like mine that I had worked with, but I didn't realize there were 12 others. And I think that is not always. It's often a very good experience for companies to come to Washington and realize, okay, I'm not alone. Together we have a voice. And especially as you talked about with some of the bigger players, I think that's a really important dynamic, especially in tech, especially in the startup world in Washington, which is the bigger players are going to have a seat at the table. If you want a seat at the table, you're going to have to go in and insist that you get one. And sometimes that's belonging to a group that gives critical mass to your issue or your in part of the industry to get there. But you will not get there unless you ask and push your way in. And other bigger companies, names of which we all know, they already have a seat at the table. They have 100 people in Washington. That's going to be easy for them to accomplish. You're going to have to work at it.
Who should the face of your company be in DC? I think this is a really interesting question. Is it the GC? Is it the CEO? Is it situational? Obviously, a potentially adversarial hearing on the Hill looks different than a friendly sort of roundtable or meeting at the White House. Talk us through how you counsel companies on who the face of the company should be.
Yeah, it's very fact specific. But, if you're betting the company, the CEO ought to be here. Now, that's not usually the case. Sometimes it is. And if it is the case, the CEO needs to be the face. If it's not the case, having the general counsel, I think, is a really good option. You look at somebody like a Brad Smith or somebody, they feel like a CEO in Washington. And that was even before he got to where he is today. 10 years ago, it was the same way. A very active person who understands policy, who's coming here and engaging with policymakers on a regular basis. And that's what I would say is probably the most important thing. It doesn't necessarily matter who the face is, but the face has to be here. You have to engage with policymakers. You have to do it on a regular basis. You have to follow up. That's something that we really pride ourselves on doing. I think maybe the Valley had a little bit of a bad rap 15 years ago. That CEOs would come flying in and then they'd be gone, and you wouldn't hear from them for another year. And that follow up is really important, and making it systematic and strategic is the real value add. And I think that some companies have gotten that and others have not.
That's a great reminder. Are there other common mistakes that you see, let's say startups, right? I mean, not the Googles of the world, but startups or smaller companies that may be just engaging a firm or may have one person on the ground in DC, mistakes that you see them make sort of time and time again that are more easily avoided?
Well, I think I mentioned this earlier, not coming in with a plan, coming in with a goal, just showing up and doing a bunch of meetings. And, policymakers talk to people all the time. They see right through it. They're like, what was the point of that? Were they just like, they just wanted to talk to me? It's political tourism. And I think a lot of companies make that mistake. They talk to somebody in California or Washington and they think, let's go do a bunch of meetings. And they either hire a firm or they set up some meetings and then they're gone. And there's no strategy, there's no goal behind it. And I think that's the biggest thing, because I think policymakers, they may not be that smart on the law or the policy or the technology, certainly. They get people. That's what their profession is understanding people. And they can see right through sort of the fake nature of some of that. And I think that's something you want to avoid because it's hard to get that capital back.
I love that phrase, political tourism. That's funny.
Yeah, we see it occasionally, and there's nothing wrong with it, but you need to have a follow up.
Yeah,
if you're really going to engage here, you need to have a reason better than it seemed like it was going to be fun.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about sort of what's coming in the fall and more topical questions. Of course, AI is on everyone's mind right now, and area where you're seeing a ton of engagement from your clients and new clients that you're picking up. Where do you see the sort of conversation around AI heading into the fall and into the next administration, whoever ends up being the next president? Yeah,
I mean, the activity around AI, the policy activity around AI has been at the highest level you can imagine. As active as anything I've ever seen in 25 years here. It's been a little unfocused. Everybody's trying to get in on the game. And that's led to a lot of noise and not a lot of progress. But I think there's still a lot more to come. I think what's going to happen is we're going to go from this sort of general debate around AI, is it good or is it bad? Is it dangerous? Is it risky? To what does it mean for healthcare? Or how is it going to transform the transportation industry? And those are much more concrete. And you start to get into these individual sectors. And you start to get some real questions. Risk is a pretty general concept, but risk in housing is a more narrowly defined question. Is AI, what are the risks for housing policy? And so I think as we start to narrow those down, as we start to break into sector specific discussions, it gets a lot more concrete. In some of those places, you're going to see some real progress. And, the big AI players, to harp on another point that I made earlier, they're here. They have a seat at the table. And they're going to shape those discussions, those policy discussions in ways that are most advantageous to them. And so smaller players, they need to get on the field and get engaged. And I think when it breaks into these individual policy areas, that creates more of an opportunity to do that. I think there's a lot more to come. Whoever is the president in 6 months, I think this is going to be a big issue. And certainly Congress will be engaged, whoever's in charge of Congress. I just think it is a coming issue. and it will continue to be extremely active.
Would it be fair to say that your advice, even to smaller companies, would be to start engaging now as opposed to wait and see for another 6 months? Or is that right?
Yeah, and this isn't a business pitch, but I firmly believe in laying groundwork for this stuff. You do not want your first meeting with somebody to be an ask, or a help me. You need to lay the groundwork. People build these relationships. There's not a handful. It's a little bit more than a handful, 20, 30, 40 members of Congress that are really involved in AI policy. You don't have to meet all 535 of them. You can meet a good handful of them and lay some groundwork. And then when push starts to come to shove at some point, you're there. You've built that relationship. I like to call it sort of the trusted advisor model. And our the value of a firm like mine is we sort of plugged into the tech industry constantly on every issue and can kind of plug you into that. But the familiarity of a company with policymakers when you have to go back in because there is a problem, or you need something, or you want something, or you want to make sure that you have a seat at the table, it's good to have laid a little groundwork. The investment is well worth the return.
How are you advising companies, maybe with that in mind too, to prepare for this election year, position themselves for success in DC, irrespective of whether or not there's another Biden administration or a Trump administration? Yeah,
I guess this is showing my gray hair a little bit. And I've been through 5 presidential transitions since I started here. My advice would be don't get distracted by that. Stick to your knitting, what you need to do. Congress is still going to be here. The administration, while it may be run by somebody else, is going to be tackling many of the same issues. And increasingly, there's some weird and new alignments in politics today. Populism that has sort of bubbled up in the Republican Party and has always been sort of bubbling in the Democratic side has created some strange bedfellows when it comes to some public policies, and the hands off the internet ideas of 10 years ago just don't exist the same way they did then. And so it is more challenging, and that's on both sides of the aisle. So I would say don't get distracted. Focus on what your policy issue is and the best way to push that forward. Most of these issues are going to be taken up regardless of who's in charge.
Just a few more questions for you, Matt. How have you seen sort of the nature of lobbying or the tactics that lobbyists use change over the course of your career? Like, are there things that are really critical today, like a social media strategy or something that were not so critical 15 years ago?
Yeah, this is a good question because I think there's been a lot written about how that has changed. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks on the PR and communications side that would sort of roll out this whole, it's all different now. And for a handful of issues in Washington each year, it is pretty different. These are run like campaigns now. And there's media, social media, and grassroots and grass tops, and all of the different facets poured into sort of a campaign around an issue. But for that's like the very tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
For the rest of it, it's still done pretty much the same way. Come up with a good policy idea, go sell it to members of Congress or the administration or an agency, or if you have if there's a problem, address that problem, and do it in a smart and policy oriented way. And that's how most business is still done here. You don't see it; it's not that popular, but that's 95% of what goes on here. Little issues that are not anything you're going to read about in the New York Times. That some company wants to push or to defend themselves on, and those issues are run more traditionally than you'd think, without sort of the big campaign, multi-million dollar or even tens or hundreds of millions of dollar campaign budgets. Most of them are done on a much smaller scale and more traditionally like we've always done it.
Usually I ask our guests at this point in time for a book recommendation. You actually gave me one a few weeks back when we were preparing for this, and I read it partially on the train to DC, called The Wolves of K Street by, I believe it's the Mullins brothers, one of whom reports for Politico, the other for the Wall Street Journal. I found it very entertaining. There are certainly, and as someone who generally likes history and was interested in sort of the history of lobbying, and Tommy Boggs, who's not someone who I had ever met, but it's very famous in DC. The history of lobbying that's presented in it is very interesting. You know, they also lay a lot of societal problems at the foot of the emergence of sort of modern lobbying and a lot of the money that flows around DC. Probably partially true, probably a little bit overblown, and not the only cause of maybe what ails the government today and some of the other problems that we see in society. What did you think of the Wolves of K Street?
I thought it was incredibly entertaining. Books are interesting when the story sort of intersects with your own life, and many of the characters in the book, or the people in the book, are folks who I've known. And many of the issues and companies that are talked about are things that I've worked on. So it was kind of fascinating to see it packaged and put into this analysis. I hit a little close to home. Again, though, this is sort of a tiny sliver of what goes on in Washington. A lot of it's not that exciting. It's a little bit more boring, and it keeps Washington moving forward. But Brody Mullins from the Wall Street Journal wrote an excellent book. I'd encourage people to read it, but don't think that that's everything that happens in Washington. That's just the highlight reel.
I've been saving maybe my hardest question for the second to last. They talk about it. You, I notice, are perfectly comfortable using the word lobbying. I've also met people before who are adamant that it needs to be referred to as government affairs or government relations. What's your take on what you should sort of call this profession and what you do?
Good question. I'm proud of what I do. I think I represent great companies, and I'm proud to have created a firm in Washington here to do that. So I don't take it as a negative at all, and I am happy to call myself a lobbyist. I get, and government affairs is probably bigger than that, right? It's not just lobbying. It's policy analysis and corporate strategy, and we hope we can be very helpful on those parts of it as well. Advocacy is just one part of what I help a company with when I represent them. But I don't shy away from the lobbyist piece at all. I'm not proud of it. I did want to go back to the book piece though, because I watched a bunch of your podcasts, and so I was ready for it. And I did have another book, so I'll give an honorable mention. The book that I just finished is the autobiography of Lenny Bruce. It's called How to Talk Dirty and Influence People. I just thought it was sort of like the most lobbyist thing I could possibly do. It is also an excellent law book. Lenny Bruce was arrested a lot, and as a First Amendment it's not exactly a legal treatise, but it is incredibly entertaining. And to hear him describe his arrests for all sorts of lewd activities that he participated in. At least at the time. Today they would seem like, not
mild,
close to being illegal. Was quite the interesting law book. So for all the lawyers listening, I'd recommend go read Lenny Bruce's autobiography. It is quite entertaining and a good legal read.
I love that. I'll add it to my Amazon cart. All right. As we start to wrap up, I've got a sort of traditional closing question that I like to ask guests. And that's, if you could look back on your days of being a young lawyer, I'll use that term in your case broadly because what you do is much more than just the law. Just getting started. What's something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then?
Yeah, it's really the value of time. It's not just as a lawyer, but as a person. Time is your biggest asset. How you use it, who you work with. You don't get to go back on these things, and pretty soon it runs out. And so don't waste it. Time is your biggest asset. Think of it that way. How am I using my time? Who am I using it to be with? And, for my example, I started the firm when I was 38 years old. I didn't really think about it at the time. But if I had waited another 5 or 6 or 7 years, it probably wouldn't have happened. And so timing is important. When you see the time, do it. The other thing, advice I'd give to people is really learn to follow your instincts. It's the real value you can add, and really hone those. And if you can trust your instinct, you can be very valuable to people. And if you're second guessing yourself, ultimately your value is not as high. So learn to trust your instincts, learn to hone those instincts. They'll be really valuable to you. So those are the two things I'd say: time and instincts.
That's great advice. Matt, thanks so much for joining me for this episode of The Abstract. This has been a lot of fun.
Tyler, thank you for having me.
And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.